Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this history festival. So I'm going to talk about Stalin's Russia today. I'm going to talk about the development of the system that emerged as the Communist Party consolidated its power after the revolution in 1917. And I'll give an overview of the enormous changes that take place in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Now, this was a time when the country seemed to be moving towards establishing some kind of new civilization. And this civilization was based on the ideas of the Communist Party, of Marx, of Lenin. It was becoming a huge industrial power. It was the powers in the hands of the workers, the industrial proletariat, and the Soviet Union would become a nuclear superpower in the 1940s. That's the party propaganda, really, that image of communist power, or the image of workers' power, of the proletariat marching confidently towards the construction of socialism. What we have in reality was Stalin consolidating his own power within the Communist Party, and then throughout the Soviet Union, more widely in the 1930s, we have his power consolidated through the purges and the terror. So for many people in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, I think two words sum up Stalinism: hope and fear. Hope that socialism was being constructed, that some kind of new civilization was being constructed, was being built, and fear of the consequences when people realized that that was not the case. So there are two things I want to look at here. Firstly, the economic reconstruction of the USSR in the 1930s, Stalin's so-called revolution from above, and then some of the means of control, particularly propaganda and terror. First, we need to be clear on what it was that the Communist Party was trying to achieve in the 1930s. Now, in theory, it was building an egalitarian society, that it was forging a democratic political structure, socialism, and the socialist economic basis that was establishing workers' control. The peasants were being brought along in this utopian vision of the future. And the ideas of Marx, of Engels, and of Lenin were used to justify what the party was doing. And it's very important to note here that there was a sense of modernity that embraced the USSR. It looked like the government of the day was following Lenin's ideas, where we have this promise of electrification, modernity, and the electrification of the country. So we have these propaganda posters here: Soviets and electrification are the basis of the new world. Communism is Soviet power plus the electrification of the whole country. So there's this promise to build a modern socialist society. And this was especially timely in the 1930s, given what looked like the collapse of capitalism in the West after the Wall Street crash and the onset of the Great Depression, and the huge amount of suffering that brought to millions of people across the Western world. However, while the Soviet Union became a new industrial power, Stalin created a vicious dictatorship with only the pretensions of democracy, only the pretensions of Soviet power itself. Stalin was the general secretary of the Communist Party. He was surrounded by his loyal lieutenants, as we can see here. So Stalin is in the middle, and we have Ordzhonikidze, Voroshilov, Kuybyshev on his right, and Kalinin, Kaganovich, and Kirov on his left. These loyal party members, loyal to Stalin himself. And I think there's also a religious aspect to this picture, because it reminds the comrades that Lenin, here in this bust behind everyone, Lenin is always with us. So there is this sort of following on of building on Lenin's promise, and Stalin used Lenin in that kind of semi-religious way. So Stalin and the Communist Party established a nationalist, conservative Soviet Union with a state-owned economy, with centralized control from Moscow, but there was no input from the workers or the peasants. So there's no sense of democracy, of no genuine democracy. And socialism and democracy have to go hand in hand. If a country claims to be socialist, but there's no way of democratically removing a government, then there is a real question mark over the socialist credentials of that country. There was mass upheaval in the countryside as well. The peasants were forcibly collectivized. So there's little evidence of the socialism as outlined by Marx and Engels and Lenin being constructed here. And there was also the glorification of Stalin through a cult of Stalin that developed throughout the 1930s. Everything that was good was associated with Stalin. All the problems were the fault of wreckers or saboteurs. And wreckers and saboteurs was part of this new vocabulary, this new language of the 1930s dictatorships. So by the end of the 1930s, the Soviet Union had established a highly industrialized modern system that was strong enough to fight off the invasion of the Nazis after 1941, to defeat fascism not only in the Soviet Union but to make an enormous contribution to defeating Nazism in Europe and the world during the Second World War. And by the end of the 1940s, because of the changes made in the USSR in the 30s, the Soviet Union developed into a nuclear superpower. But all of this was achieved at an enormous human cost, as industrialization in the Soviet Union saw the worst excesses of 19th century industrial capitalism as experienced in Western powers like Britain rolled into one decade. And politically, there was the destruction of the Communist Party through the purges and the terror. So, what form did the Soviets' economic reconstruction take? Well, it was based on introducing a planned economy to have a heavy industrial base and collective farming. Now, in November 1929, Stalin declared that we are advancing full steam ahead to socialism. So this propaganda poster highlights the importance of industrialization. We have the huge ship carrying the Soviet Union forward and throwing to one side the old order. Stalin said that we are leaving behind the age-old Russian backwardness. The Soviet Union was becoming a country of metal, of automobiles, of tractors. And once the Soviet Union was on an automobile, once the peasant was using a tractor, then he challenged the so-called worthy capitalists, as he called them, who boast of their civilization, to overtake the Soviet Union. We shall yet see, he said, which countries may then be classified as backward and which as advanced. So it's in this year, November 1929, that collectivization was launched. And we see this expansion of collective farming. Collectivization was an integral part of the Soviet industrialization program, which itself was a fundamental part of reorganizing the Soviet economy as a whole, moving away from the moderate market forces and free markets elements of the NEP years of Lenin in the 1920s. And it meant that the government would have control over food production, over its distribution. It would get food to the workers in the factories. So the Communist Party was committed to industrialization for a number of reasons. Ideologically, it was crucial. It was necessary for building socialism, to establish a proletariat who supported the Communist Party. The planned economy itself was favoured. It would end the vagaries of the free market capitalist experiment of NEP in the 20s. Militarily and strategically, industrialization was necessary. It accelerated industrialization. This was necessary to counter the threat from what Stalin now saw as hostile capitalist forces. And in terms of socialism versus capitalism, it was economically superior. It was seen as being economically superior. It was necessary to prove the superiority of Soviet socialism. So this all, so there's a positive attitude that comes within this from sections of society. We believe what the party is telling them, and at the same time as this sort of economic revolution, there's a cultural revolution which looked to reshape the workers and the peasants, to reshape their lives in art, in literature, in music, in technical skills at work. So there's an emphasis now that looked to expand education, to make a more educated working class, as the Communist Party wanted to create an intelligentsia of working class origins, to move away from the bourgeois intelligentsia of the 1910s and 1920s, and to create a proletarian intelligentsia. And this would allow the party to end its dependence on on bourgeois technical experts. So these new experts would be red experts, would be communist, ideologically sound, proletarian in origin, in their class origin, and specialists. And this massive expansion of education was successful. So there's a huge expansion of an education program. There are huge literacy campaigns, and it has a profound effect on both the Soviet system and on the lives of workers and peasants. So by 1939, male literacy was up to 90.8%, and rising from about 30 to 40% just sort of a few decades earlier. And female literacy followed with 72.5% as well. So the party was creating this intelligentsia of a working class origin. So there are significant changes at the lower ends of society, and there are improvements that come along with these changes from the party. The party's focusing on society as a whole, not just on the economy. And this huge change was very much in Stalin's mind, because he was concerned about being overtaken or being crushed by the Western hostile capitalist forces. So he was still worried about this in the early 1930s. And this is when he made his quite a famous declaration. He said, "The tempo must not be reduced." So he's talking about the speed of change. "On the contrary, we must increase it as much as is within our powers and possibilities. To slacken the tempo would mean falling behind, and those who fall behind get beaten. We refuse to be beaten. We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it or we shall go under." So there was a recognition here that the Soviet Union was lagging behind. It was comparatively behind Western powers. So Stalin's tasks of business executives in 1931 shows some of his concerns, and it emphasizes his desire for modernization. It highlights his reasons for wanting to build a strong country to ensure that the Soviet Union was secure, and to ensure its security, that it was secure in any challenges, any invasion from these hostile forces. So the emphasis here was on speed. The tempo must not be reduced. We must increase it. We must increase the speed of change, the speed of modernity. If it was obvious then that it was about speed, about rapid change, then it was difficult, I think, for the party to be concerned with the human cost. And so the Soviet industrialization was built on a foundation of slave labor and of coercion. And this is where we get the kulaks coming into the situation. The kulak is the Russian word for fist, or in this term it means the rich peasant, i.e. the one who controls the money, the tight fist. So the rich peasants, the kulaks, were often herded certainly into collective farms, but also if they resisted, they could be the ones who were sent to the prison camps. So in the prison camps, the gulags, as we can see here, this sort of vast network of slave labor in some ways, but prison camps known as the gulags, stretching from European Russia, from the European Soviet Union, all the way through Siberia, Norilsk, or to Yakutsk, to Magadan, all the way down to Vladivostok. So this is an enormous empire, and it's an economic empire because slave laborers are there. They are found and they are taken and relocated to work on enormous industrial projects like the White Sea Canal. But it's also part of the means of control for the party, which I'll talk a bit more about a little later. But we have the rich peasants working alongside the criminal elements, working alongside free workers who had done nothing wrong but found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time, perhaps because the party and the government needed an extra workforce. So these huge changes that take place in agriculture saw the peasants forced onto these collective farms in what was often seen as an attack on the peasantry. And there was great resistance from the peasants. So moving away from this sort of totalitarian model of people doing what they're told by a cruel and dictatorial Stalin, we actually have either some support for what the party's doing in industry, or brave resistance from thousands of peasants who rejected what the party wanted them to do and fought against it. So there are struggles between the peasantry and the Communist Party, and the totalitarian model of the Soviet system doesn't allow for that resistance. It only allows for a kind of a passive population. So there are many disagreements between the peasants and the party, and the peasants would often slaughter their livestock rather than hand it over to the government. They would gorge on their grain rather than give it to the Communist Party. Some even set fire to their houses rather than hand it over to the state. There are rebellions, there are riots, there are demonstrations, there are strikes against the party's collectivization policy. If you're interested in this, the historian Lynn Viola has written extensively on this, and she's written some wonderful books on the peasantry, on collectivization, on the resistance to the party. So there is a sort of a major wave of resistance in the first part of the 1930s. And Stephen Cohen says that Stalin's mass terror began in the years 1929 to 1933 with the ruthless methods he used in the countryside: armed force, often fatal deportations of entire families, and widespread famine. So coercion and control was also bound up in the economic reconstruction of the Soviet Union under Stalin. And the most famous example of the famine occurred in 1932-33. It hit Ukraine, it hit Kazakhstan, it reached into the wider Volga region of Russia, and somewhere between 5 and 7 million people died in this famine. They died because of the Soviet Union's actions, the party's actions. Now, there is still much debate today about the nature, about the cause of this famine. So historians like Robert Conquest argue that Stalin used famine as a means of breaking the peasantry to end Ukrainian nationalism. And Conquest famously called this a terror famine. So it's a deliberate policy by Stalin to crush the peasantry, to break the backs of the peasants in Ukraine, and the wider region, Kazakhstan and into the Volga, and to break Ukrainian nationalism as well. However, the counter argument to that, as put forward by revisionist historians like R.W. Davies, argue that there simply was not enough of the food reserves that was necessary to be able to give to the peasants when it became clear that there was a crisis, that there was a famine. There wasn't enough food because of mistakes that were made in Moscow earlier as part of the wider collectivization process. So instead of being a deliberate policy by Stalin, this was actually a disastrously mismanaged policy that had terrible consequences. That this was human error by politicians in Moscow, not a specifically driven desire to crush the peasants. Now, however we interpret this, the famine was an enormous tragedy, and it was the tragic loss of life in a decade that became characterized by death. So collectivization came with a huge cost in human life. There was increased suffering that was caused to those who survived this mass shift in Soviet agriculture. There was famine, there was death, there was psychological trauma and shock. There was the erosion of the traditional Russian rural culture that had existed for hundreds of years. There was the peasants becoming alienated from the regime. There was an attack on traditional religion. So we can see how this upheaval in the countryside led to suffering and it characterized collectivization. However, the flip side in terms of industrialization saw various benefits being brought to citizens' lives, particularly in the industrializing cities. So there's a concentration on production that comes via heavy industry. So there's a shift in industrialization towards heavy industry of steel production, of coal, of energy, to promote the defence of the Soviet Union. But we also see things like the Moscow Metro opening up in the mid-1930s. So again, we've got a propaganda poster. There is a metro. Long live, in the corner there it says, "Long live our beloved Stalin." There are no fortresses that the Bolsheviks cannot storm. And here we have the first test train on the Moscow Underground in the mid-30s. There are new modern planned cities that are beginning to emerge across the Soviet Union. The most famous is probably Magnitogorsk, or Magnetic Mountain. So this was built just here in sort of the southern Ural Mountains. It brings modernity and development to sort of to regions far away from Moscow. This becomes known as the Socialist City of Steel, and it has a population of 250,000 by 1932. And it wasn't just about housing the workers, it's about giving them something more than just work. So there's the metallurgical plants, but there's a cinema, theatre, a circus. It's about trying to develop life away from work, whilst also focusing on the development of the Communist Party and the party's ideals, the political ideals. And crucially, at a time when unemployment was so rife in the West because of the Great Depression, in the Soviet Union there was no unemployment. Unemployment had been planned away. So this was a powerful image for many in the 1930s. In the 1930s hit Great Depression countries. So the Soviet Union became a beacon of hope and a beacon of socialist light for many socialists in the West. They looked to the Soviet Union and said, that's the kind of model that we want to follow. Obviously not necessarily knowing all of the details of the horrors of what's going on inside. Now, the emphasis was on production inside the Soviet Union, and the emphasis was on quantity, not on quality. So what was produced was not always very good. There were low living standards for much of the period. Heavy industry was emphasized rather than consumer goods. There were some consumer goods, however, and in the mid-1930s there was an improvement to citizens' lives, an improvement to consumers' lives as more consumer goods became available. It was a clear, conscious policy of the party to improve the quality of life for ordinary citizens. So we have things like Soviet champagne, Sovietskoye Champanskoye, chocolate and a perfume becoming more available in the shops. Now, things like champagne we would associate as being a drink of the aristocrats, of the upper class in the West. In the Soviet Union, it becomes a very democratic drink. It's cheap enough for workers to enjoy. By 1942, there were 12 million bottles being produced. At one point, it was being sold on tap in food stores next to fruit juice. So there are success stories that come out of this Soviet economic reconstruction. And this creates a groundswell of support for Stalin and for the party, from the sort of support from below. So we shouldn't underestimate this support, as many people did believe that a new civilization was being established, that the suffering that was going on in the West during the Great Depression appeared to confirm the superiority of socialism in the Soviet Union. However, there were also significant problems that came with industrialization and with collectivization. So industrialization, there were imbalances within the system. So textiles, chemical industries were failing to advance as they should do. They weren't given the opportunity to grow. The system was difficult to coordinate because the orders came from the top down. There was no democratic relationship between what the workers and the peasants needed at the ground level and what the party wanted them to do in Moscow. And of course, there were these coercive methods and slave labour being utilised as well. There was very little consideration being given to the working conditions in the factories or the fields. So Stalin's revolution from above brought with it a mixed story. It was supported by some, it was resisted by others. And when we consider the resistance to Stalin, we can see that the system came to symbolize the control and coercion that we will now turn to. But it was necessary, or it was thought necessary by the party and by Stalin, that coercion would be the way to get people to do what they wanted. So the means of control that the party used included propaganda, of course, and there was this cult of Stalin that grew in the 1930s. It made Stalin into a godlike figure. And he was a hero, and he revised Russian history to tie him to other old strong, powerful leaders, sort of people, Russian strong Russian czars from the past. So people like Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great were now seen as Russian heroes, and Stalin was tied to them because they were seen as obviously cruel leaders, but the decisions they had taken were justified because of the constructive ends that they had served. So they had built a stronger Russia by the end of their rule, even though this Russia had been built by using harsh coercive means. And of course, this is exactly the story we have with Stalin. So officially, every effort was made to prove that the Soviet Union was the best country in the world, that socialism was the best system. And newsreels would often show happy workers and enthusiastic builders of socialism in the factories and the fields, a happy and democratic Soviet Union. As I said earlier, everything good was linked to Stalin. So here we have again a couple of propaganda posters. On the one on the left with the planes have Soviet leaders' names on: Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin. And the slogan at the bottom says, "Long live our happy socialist motherland, long live our beloved great Stalin." And then the other one is of Stalin, this benevolent, kindly father figure, a father of the nation, surrounded by happy children. Thanks to our beloved Stalin for our happy childhood. Now, there's of course there has to be some truth in the official messages, otherwise propaganda simply can't work. So there is an element of truth here, and many people knew the kind of system that was being constructed. But where gentle persuasion through propaganda didn't work or couldn't work, there were mass arrests by Stalin's secret police, the NKVD, the forerunner of the KGB that you may have heard of. So they're the arrest of the NKVD and then being sent to the gulags. So Soviet citizens sent to the gulags were part of this much wider group of Stalin's victims, as he had oppositionists inside the party removed during the show trials, during the purges, and then the wider terror that hit society. Now, the background to this assault on the old Bolsheviks. Old Bolsheviks is the phrase used for members of the party who were there present during either before the revolution or during the revolution. So we had this assault on the old Bolsheviks that begins with the 17th Party Congress in 1934, and this party congress was known as the Congress of Victors. And it was a key year in the start towards the purges and the terror. The Soviet Union was apparently now on the road to communism. The party took time out to acknowledge this great leap forward. Yet Stalin found that there was still dissent within the Communist Party ranks, and he believed that his position may be threatened. The problem here for Stalin was the popularity of one particular leading figure, and that was the Communist Party boss of Leningrad, the Leningrad Party, Sergei Kirov. Kirov was a loyal comrade. He was close to Stalin, but he started to talk about a more cautious approach to collectivization, to have less peasant exploitation. So he was seen as a slightly gentler leader, a gentler communist leader. And he was murdered on the 1st of December 1934. So he wasn't in favour of changing direction completely, but he did favour less hostile policies, especially in the countryside. And many delegates at this Congress of Victors in 1934 agreed with Kirov And they began to there was a show of support for Kirov, and it looked like Kirov was becoming more and more popular in the party. And it looked like this was a message that was being sent to Stalin, that many Communist Party members were unhappy with the suffering that accompanied collectivization, and it looked like Kirov's star was on the rise. So this has led some historians like Robert Conquest, one of the sort of leading historians who follow this totalitarian interpretation of the Soviet Union. It's led Conquest to argue that it was necessary for Stalin to eliminate this popular rival to his power. So according to Conquest, the order was given for Kirov's murder. The order came from Stalin himself. And on the 1st of December 1934, a lone gunman, Leonid Nikolaev, walked into the Smolny Institute in Leningrad, which is where the party had its headquarters, and shot Kirov dead. Now, for Conquest, Stalin was to blame, and it's easy to see why Stalin got the blame for this. There's much blood on Stalin's hands. He was willing to remove close comrades if necessary. Now, the problem for other historians is that there's no evidence that has ever been found to link Stalin directly to Kirov's murder. We can say, of course, Stalin had him murdered. He was popular. He looked like he could be a challenge to Stalin. Stalin didn't worry about killing people, so therefore we can add all of these pieces together and come up with this answer. But that's not really good enough for historians. We want that crucial piece of paper, that crucial bit of evidence. Perhaps even that crucial smoking gun, if you like. So there were two official Communist Party commissions that were set up under Khrushchev and Gorbachev later on, both leaders who would benefit from being able to link Stalin to Kirov's murder, but there was no link found even in these official commissions. So how do we explain Kirov's death? Well, it could be that it was the NKVD that was to blame. Just as the workers and the peasants had quotas to fulfill, so too did the secret police. They had to ensure that they couldn't be seen as being politically suspect if they weren't fulfilling their quotas. The problem is, what if there wasn't enough real spies or real political opponents to the party to form a genuine danger to Stalin and the Soviet Union? So the secret police, the NKVD, would have to invent these enemies to ensure that there were these constant threats to the Soviet state, to ensure their own reason to exist. If we accept this view, then it means that Stalin wasn't guilty for Kirov's murder, but his secret police was. Either way, Stalin used Kirov's death to strengthen the NKVD's power and his own position. The day Kirov was murdered, the Politburo passed a new decree. It was new anti-terrorist laws were giving freedom gave more freedom to the prosecutors. They were accused. They could accuse the accused no longer had to have defense lawyers. And they could question suspects without relying on witnesses, and there was no chance of appeal. So in December 1934, both Stalin and the NKVD became stronger because of this. And they were sort of feeding off one another's insecurities and fears. And this led to the widespread repression in Leningrad, to a clampdown on other alleged anti-Soviet activities. So Leonid Nikolaev himself was tried and shot, and then a further 6,500 people were shot, and there were other victims within this clampdown. Old comrades of Stalin's, of Lenin's and Stalin's from the revolution, like Zinoviev and Kamenev, were also arrested and blamed for Kirov's death. Censorship was now tightened as well. And Robert Conquest called this decree of December 1934 a charter for terror. He said, the timing of the decree shows that there was evidence for the purges, that the purges were pre-planned, that Kirov was murdered on Stalin's orders. It removed a dangerous rival. It ensured total control over a compliant people through mass repression. However, it is possible that Stalin was genuinely shaken by the murder of a close friend and someone he saw as a protege, that Stalin genuinely now believed that there were enemies everywhere. So the decree was therefore a panicky response by a nervous leadership, that there was no predetermined plot for purges. While Stalin took the opportunity to tighten his grip on power, it could be that he had nothing to do directly with the act of murder that killed Kirov. Now, the Kirov affair itself petered out, but only for a short time, and it wasn't long before a new round of purges began. The NKVD needed to continue to remind Stalin of its purpose, and Stalin continued to rely on the NKVD to do so. And it's this dynamic that led to the show trials and the purges within the party. This turned into an assault on the whole system. It wasn't simply the Communist Party that was hit. It reached into the wider society in the Great Terror of 1937-38. Now, when we look at the purges and the show trials, the starting point, of course, was before the show trial. It was necessary to accuse those who are accused of any crimes of the state by the state. It was necessary to ensure that they would plead guilty. There's no point putting on a show trial if it didn't deter others from following the path that was alleged the alleged guilty individuals were following. So confessions were now obtained through sleep deprivation, through torture. The accused had their families threatened. Interrogations would take place at the NKVD's headquarters here in the Lubyanka building in Moscow. Stalin now ordered the NKVD to organize trials of Trotskyites and Zinovievites. The Central Committee sent secret letters to regional Communist Party bosses regarding the alleged terrorist activities of what they called a Trotskyite Zinovievite counter-revolutionary bloc. So we have the start of 3 show trials in August 1936, January 1937 and March 1938. And here we have the audience who are at the show trials. So in August 1936, Zinoviev, Kamenev and 14 other party officials were targeted. In January 37, Karl Radek, Grigory Pyatakov and Grigory Sokolnikov were hit. And then in March 1938, Nikolai Bukharin, Alexei Rykov and Genurik Yagoda. And Yagoda was the NKVD boss before Yeshov, which reminds us that anyone could be targeted within these show trials. So there's a range of ridiculous charges against party members. They were supposedly part of a Trotskyite counter-revolutionary bloc. They were taking orders from Trotsky. They were carrying out wrecking activities. They wanted to restore capitalism. They were involved in terrorist activities. All ridiculous, chumped-up charges. The confessions of those on trial would lead many people to believe the charges against them. All of the accused who took part in this facade were sentenced to death and shot in the back of the head, which was the NKVD's trademark, or they were sentenced to years in prison. And their confessions also implicated other old Bolsheviks, and that led to the 2nd and 3rd show trials. So the Communist Party was now turning in on itself. The NKVD demanded more confessions to ensure the fulfillment of their own quota. The confessions of those who stood trial inevitably implicated others, and so on and so on. So ordinary Communist Party workers were now caught up in this mass purging. Hundreds of thousands of communists were purged from the party, especially if they were seen or perceived to be perceived as a threat to Stalin. For ordinary citizens, however, the purges was often seen as something that was happening to the leaders at the top. It had little to do with the rest of society. But then the Great Terror began, and it spread throughout the system. It targeted the leading Communist Party officials who were considered unreliable, senior military officers, the Communist Party and state leaders at national Republican level, even, as with Yagoda, communist NKVD leaders themselves. And then we move into the Great Terror in 1937. So we've had the show trials, the purges, the terror. Now it's sort of engulfing the whole, not just system, but the whole country, or elements of the whole country. The Politburo wanted to widen its search for counter-revolutionary forces, and it ordered the shooting of anyone who was found guilty. Stalin sent telegrams to local authorities that were who were deemed to be enemies of the people. They were to be shot without question. This order was approved. Stalin also approved torture as a means of getting confessions. The NKVD's reach then extended far outside of the Communist Party itself, and it had devastating consequences. Hundreds of thousands of people, of communists, of army personnel, of NKVD agents, of ethnic groups were now targeted. And the net was cast further than Moscow. This was the start of an attack, of sort of a violent attack on other areas of the system. It was an all-embracing policy that was confirmed in November 1937 when Stalin spoke of destroying all sworn enemies of the Soviet Union. Soviet citizens suffered greatly during the terror. Many social bonds were broken between people. People were arrested by the NKVD while others would turn against one another as neighbour denounced neighbour, worker denounced corrupt or spiteful Communist Party boss. Some acted this way for ideological reasons. They genuinely believed that there was a threat to communism. They genuinely believed that, well, these were sort of known as loyalty denunciations. They genuinely believed that the communist cause was being damaged. Some used it as a weapon of the weak. People often had few other ways of fighting back against a system that treated them so harshly. And this gave the purges and the terror another dynamic, a force from below. So again, not everything was coming from the top or being controlled by the top. This was now coming from below. There are reactions that this took on a life of its own. And we have the reactions from the leaders in Moscow who now interpreted this as evidence of indeed the enemies that they believed were everywhere. At other times, the chaos meant that Moscow was unaware of the arrests that was taking place during the Great Terror. The further we are away from Moscow, the less likely Moscow would know what's going on. Local Communist Party bosses used Moscow's orders to fulfill their own purposes. So they would settle old scores against local enemies. So definitely not a part of the sort of this loyalty affair. Of course, ultimately, Stalin benefited from all of this. It removed rivals, both past and present, well, they were permanently removed, so they were no longer or could no longer be a threat to Stalin. The Great Terror may not have touched everyone directly or indirectly, despite what traditional historians or histories of Stalin's Russia would have suggested, but it was still a deeply dangerous time to be alive in Stalin's Russia. Now, the fear that was felt by many Soviet citizens led to enormous stress, emotional hardship that was experienced by ordinary citizens, ordinary people who are just trying to survive in a rapidly changing world, and millions of people were affected in one way or another. So how do we explain the purges and the terror? What are the driving forces of the purges and terror? Well, there are two key schools of thought: the totalitarian school and the revisionists. So for the totalitarian school, people like Conquest, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Stalin was to blame for everything. Everything came through Stalin. Stalin was deeply suspicious. He was an evil genius who was acting competently and with self-control. He removed opposition. He removed anyone who may remember history differently from him, i.e. the old Bolsheviks. This was a conscious and deliberate attempt to ensure total control over the party and the population. The revisionists, like J.R. Getty and Roberta Manning, argue that Stalin was important, but he wasn't the sole agent, that the institutional aspects, the institutional factors were also responsible. So they're unconvinced that Stalin organised Kirov's murder. The focus has to be on the social institutional factors like the NKVD as well, and the periphery was engaged in arrests and terror that Moscow wasn't necessarily aware of. So the purges take on a life of its own. It creates this dynamic from below. Now, there's still no definitive answer as to how many people died during this assault on the system and on the country. or indeed how many people were imprisoned, partly because we still don't have all the data from the archives, and partly because there's no, they're not necessarily included in this, those individuals who were guilty of general crimes, not necessarily political crimes, or those who we can't exclude those who were still free, but then sort of, or free workers who were then sent to the gulags as sort of innocent victims of Stalin's rule. Estimates at the moment for the peak years of 1937-38 have settled on somewhere between, and as I say, quite vague, but somewhere between 682,000 to 1.5 million executions, and somewhere between 2 and 10 million gulag inmates. So a few concluding thoughts. We have genuine support for Stalin and the Communist Party in the 1930s amongst various groups. Many people believed in what the party was doing, and believed in Stalin, especially when industrialization brought key benefits to individuals and to the country overall. There was indeed a better life for some, although it's important to remember that this could often depend on luck. It could depend on who you were, where you were, whether you were lucky enough to escape the purges and the terror. The Soviet Union restructured its economy to plan away unemployment at a time when this was a huge problem in the West. It made the Soviet Union strong enough to defeat the Nazis after the invasion of 1941, and to help to defeat fascism during the wider Second World War. And Stalin led an extraordinary transformation of what was a peasant-based country, leading it into an urban, industrialized great power. And later on, he established the Soviet Union as a nuclear power, one of two nuclear superpowers at the start of the Cold War. So to paraphrase one of Stalin's many biographers, Isaac Deutscher, Stalin found the country with a plow and left it with a nuclear bomb. So there are enormous changes that took place in Stalin's Russia in the 30s. However, coercion and control were central. These were core aspects of the life of the Soviet citizens in the 30s. They were key characteristics of Stalinism. We can question whether the purges and the wider attack on the party had to become a wider attack on society. It's possible that the results were the result of the forces from below, following these sort of denunciations, that they created this this dynamic from below rather than just coming from the top down. But we can say that the propaganda, the force that was used, the central coercion from Stalin were central to Stalinism. They were central to Stalin's power. If we remove them, we have something very different that wouldn't be Stalinism. The way that Stalin and the party forced these changes was brutal. It involved repression, extreme force, coercion, exploitation, excessive state power, death, and a grotesque cult of personality, which turned Stalin into a combination of a sort of a mafia godfather, a czar, and a godlike figure. And he used this power and his position to create a powerful system that would become a nuclear superpower after the war. But the human and political cost was extraordinarily high. So I'll leave you with one question that we can either discuss afterwards, or you can take away and think about later on. Was Stalin good for the country, but bad for the people? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. That was fantastic, really useful session and really insightful and great to hear from you. So, you know, I would really like to hope that there's going to be some questions from our guests that have joined the session today. So I'll just open up that Q&A, and if you do have any questions at all regarding the session that Jonathan has delivered today, or if it is about history at ARU or anything like that, then please do pop that in the chat. So we've got a question already. Thank you so much, Mia. Very quick on the mark there. So the question is, Jonathan, why did the party want to improve life for people in cities and make it worse for those in the countryside?
That's an excellent question. Thank you, Mia. I don't know if there was well, there was certainly a desire to make life better in the cities, because that's where the industrial workers lived. And so if we accept that the party was trying to build this a communist state that was built on the ideas of the industrial working class leading the future, then the party had to improve the lives of the industrial workers in the cities. They are also the natural, or always seen as the ones who are the natural supporters of the party. So they're kind of giving back to people they wanted to earn or to ensure the loyalty of. In terms of the life of in the countryside, there was less concern given to the peasants, less concern given to the agricultural sector, partly again because the party believed in the industrial workers. But of course, if we're looking at it from a genuinely communist ideal, then all aspects of the system should have been supported, should have been seen their lives improve. But if we accept sort of the kind of I suppose the more aggressive or totalitarian view of the of Soviet or Stalinist history, then we can say that this was a conscious decision by Stalin to break the peasant resistance, because again there's that push towards collectivization, which was again leaving behind the market forces of the 1920s, the individual capitalist or net men as they were known, they're sort of the market, those who benefited from the market forces being reintroduced in the 1920s. There's now a desire to break with that in the 1930s by Stalin, and the peasants were always seen viewed with suspicion by Stalin. So it's either a conscious decision to break the resistance of the peasants, to break the backs of the peasantry and make a more compliant population. And bearing in mind, you know, the agrarian population is still the majority of people in the Soviet Union at this point, or it's just a lack of care, a lack of concern. They were more concerned with the industrial workers because those are the workers they had to secure the loyalty of, and they just didn't care about the peasantry. So it's again, that's a slightly complicated answer, but it's based in the historiography of how you see the Soviet Union and sort of which school you fit into, the totalitarianists or the revisionists. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Jonathan. I hope that's useful for you, Mia, as well. So thank you very much for your question. And we've got a few more minutes. I think we've got approximately 4 minutes left for the session. So if there are any other questions, please do pop them in the chat. I know that we do have some typing. So we've got another question here. What were they doing in the prison camps and how long were people in them for?
So an excellent question, given that the gulags were a central part of the system. So in the prison camp, we should firstly point out that the gulags were different to the Nazi concentration camp, or particularly the Nazi death camp. So the purpose of a gulag was not to kill the citizens or kill the inmates. It was sort of rehabilitation. You know, if they were genuinely seen as not educated in the communist ways that Stalin believed in, or Stalin wanted to put forward, then there would be re-education programs, but they were often used as slave labor. So one argument that comes through the historiography of Stalin's Russia is that because of the huge economic reconstruction that takes place, more workers were needed for huge projects, like, for example, the White Sea Canal construction. And so rather than concentrating on or worrying about paying workers good wages and ensuring good working conditions, which of course you would expect in a socialist society, you have this vast slave labor pool that you can go to the gulags for and find, you know, all these workers and ship them out to different parts of the system, or indeed to the salt mines, and to produce for the system. So life in the prisons were harsh, intolerable, and many people did die. But the sort of that again, that was through a lack of concern for the inmates rather than a specific aim. So they weren't death camps, they were labour camps. How long were they in there for? Well, that would depend on the crimes they had committed, on the sentences they were given. So it could be 5 years or 10 years hard labour. Some people were in there for sent in there for 20 years, and there was often an expectation in the party in Moscow that these people would not be seen again. And this became quite a shock when a lot of these people were freed after Stalin's death. So Khrushchev freed these Gulag inmates. There were sort of 3 or 4 million who were freed in the 50s. And there are stories of how Gulag inmates would often or would occasionally bump into the person who had sent them there. And the look of surprise and shock and horror on their face was often quite extraordinary. Again, so I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Jonathan. We've got another question here. So I was wondering about Stalin's politics outside of Russia, for example, South America or sub-Saharan Africa, for example, and how they installed them.
Wow, that's a fantastic question. So I think that when we're looking at, I mean, they're quite different regions to look at. So as I said in the talk, Stalin's Russia or Soviet Union becomes a beacon of hope for many people in the 1930s, especially as capitalism looked like it was collapsing. But so Stalinist communist parties were linked, or the communist parties around the world were linked to Moscow, had funding and backing from Moscow, and leaders in these countries, maybe, or in regions in sub-Saharan Africa or in South America, would often go to Moscow as part of a wider kind of internationalist brotherhood of communists, and they would be trained in Moscow. They would develop their links, they would be taught how to do things, then they would take these techniques back to their countries, or just again in sort of naturally people in communist parties in South Africa, sort of South America, for example, would read the books of Lenin and of Marx and Engels and of the sort of how to go about leading a revolution, and they would again then follow the model of the Russian Revolution in 1917, and follow the model of Soviet development, and that of course was Stalinist development in the 1930s. And the same thing happened in China as well after 1949. So China becomes a sort of a Stalinist model in China. So there are a number of reasons or a number of ways in which international communist parties would lead their revolutions and install their power.
Thank you, Jonathan. We've had some really good questions there to finish that session, which is really useful, and it's really great when we do have questions coming through from these sessions. So thank you very much to our guests today for that. And we are sort of at the close of the session today. So first and foremost, a big thank you to you, Jonathan, for delivering the session today, and for supporting the Q&A that we've had at the end there, and also to our attendees that have attended the session today. As I said at the beginning, I am going to post in the chat just now a short feedback form, and it would be great if you could just spend a moment or two filling this in for us. It's really useful for us to have your feedback, because it does allow us to inform the planning for future events, and allows us to sort of analyse, what went well with these sessions, and perhaps things that we can do differently next time. So if you did have a moment, we would really appreciate you filling that in for us. So yeah, thank you so much, Jonathan. I really appreciate your time today. And to our guests, thank you for joining, and perhaps we'll see you in some of the sessions later on this week.
Thanks, Laura.